Husband at home, Mrs. Verloc? He asked in an easy, full tone.
No, he's gone out.
I am sorry for that. I've called to get from him a little private information. This was the exact truth. Chief Inspector Heat had been all the way home and had even gone so far as to think of getting into his slippers, since practically he told himself, chucked out of that case. He indulged in some scornful and in a very few angry thoughts, and found the occupation so unsatisfactory that he resolved to seek relief out of doors. Nothing prevented him paying a friendly call on Mr. Verloc, casually, as it were. It was in the character of a private citizen that, walking out privately, he made use of his customary conveyances. Their general direction was towards Mr. Verloc's home. Chief Inspector Heat respected his own private character so consistently that he took especial pains to avoid all the police constables on point and patrol duty in the vicinity of Brett Street. This precaution was much more necessary for a man of his standing than for an obscure assistant commissioner. Private Citizen Heat entered the street, maneuvering in a way which in a member of the criminal classes would have been stigmatized as slinking. The piece of cloth picked up in Greenwich was in his pocket. Not that he had the slightest intention of producing it in his private capacity. On the contrary, he wanted to know just what Mr. Verloc would be disposed to say voluntarily. He hoped Mr. Verloc's talk would be of a nature to incriminate Michaelis. It was a conscientiously professional hope in the main, but not without its moral value, for Chief Inspector Heat was a servant of justice. Finding Mr. Verloc from home, he felt disappointed. "I would wait for him a little if I were sure he wouldn't be long," he said. Mrs. Verloc volunteered no assurance of any kind. "The information I need is quite private," he repeated. "You understand what I mean. I wonder if you could give me a notion where he's gone to." Mrs. Verloc shook her head. "Can't say." She turned away to range some boxes on the shelves behind the counter. Chief Inspector Heat looked at her thoughtfully for a time. "I suppose you know who I am," he said. Mrs. Verloc glanced over her shoulder. Chief Inspector Heat was amazed at her coolness. "Come, you know I am in the police," he said sharply. "I don't trouble my head much about it," Mrs. Verloc remarked, returning to the ranging of her boxes. "My name is Heat, Chief Inspector Heat of the Special Crimes Section." Mrs. Verloc adjusted nicely in its place a small cardboard box, and turning round, faced him again, heavy-eyed, with idle hands hanging down. A silence reigned for a time. "So your husband went out a quarter of an hour ago, and he didn't say when he would be back?" "He didn't go out alone," Mrs. Verloc let fall negligently. "A friend?" Mrs. Verloc touched the back of her hair. It was in perfect order. "A stranger who called." "I see. What sort of man was that stranger? Would you mind telling me?" Mrs. Verloc did not mind. And when Chief Inspector Heat heard of a man dark, thin, with a long face and turned-up mustaches, he gave signs of perturbation and exclaimed, "Dash me if I didn't think so. He hasn't lost any time." He was intensely disgusted in the secrecy of his heart at the unofficial conduct of his immediate chief, but he was not quixotic. He lost all desire to await Mr. Verloc's return. What they had gone out for he did not know, but he imagined it possible that they would return together. "The case is not followed properly. It's being tampered with," he thought bitterly. "I'm afraid I haven't time to wait for your husband," he said. Mrs. Verloc received this declaration listlessly. Her detachment had impressed Chief Inspector Heat all along. At this precise moment it whetted his curiosity. Chief Inspector Heat hung in the wind, swayed by his passions like the most private of citizens. "I think," he said, looking at her steadily, "that you could give me a pretty good notion of what's going on, if you liked." Forcing her fine, inert eyes to return his gaze, Mrs. Verloc murmured, "Going on? What is going on?" "Why, the affair I came to talk about a little with your husband." That day Mrs. Verloc had glanced at a morning paper, as usual, but she had not stirred out of doors. The newsboys never invaded Brett Street. It was not a street for their business. And the echo of their cries, drifting along the populous thoroughfares, expired between the dirty brick walls without reaching the threshold of the shop. Her husband had not brought an evening paper home. At any rate, she had not seen it. Mrs. Verloc knew nothing whatever of any affair, and she said so, with a genuine note of wonder in her quiet voice. Chief Inspector Heat did not believe for a moment in so much ignorance. Curtly, without amiability, he stated the bare fact. Mrs. Verloc turned away her eyes. "I call it silly," she pronounced slowly. She paused. "We ain't downtrodden slaves here." The chief inspector waited watchfully. Nothing more came. "And your husband didn't mention anything to you when he came home?" Mrs. Verloc simply turned her face from right to left in sign of negation. A languid, baffling silence reigned in the shop. Chief Inspector Heat felt provoked beyond endurance. "There was another small matter," he began in a detached tone, "which I wanted to speak to your husband about. There came into our hands what we believe is a stolen overcoat." Mrs. Verloc, with her mind specially aware of thieves that evening, touched lightly the bosom of her dress. "We have lost no overcoat," she said calmly. "That's funny," continued Private Citizen Heat. "I see you keep a lot of marking ink here." He took up a small bottle and looked at it against the gas jet in the middle of the shop. "Purple, isn't it?" he remarked, setting it down again. "As I said, it's strange, because the overcoat has got a label sewn on the inside with your address written in marking ink." Mrs. Verloc leaned over the counter with a low exclamation. "That's my brother's, then." "Where's your brother? Can I see him?" asked the chief inspector briskly. Mrs. Verloc leaned a little more over the counter. "No, he isn't here. I wrote that label myself." "Where's your brother now?" "He's been away living with a friend in the country." "The overcoat comes from the country. And what's the name of the friend?" "Michaelis," confessed Mrs. Verloc in an awed whisper. The chief inspector let out a whistle. His eyes snapped. "Just so. Capital. And your brother now, what's he like? A sturdy, darkish chap, eh?" "Oh, no," exclaimed Mrs. Verloc fervently. "That must be the thief. Stevie's slight and fair." "Good," said the chief inspector in an approving tone. And while Mrs. Verloc, wavering between alarm and wonder, stared at him, he sought for information. Why have the address sewn like this inside the coat? And he heard that the mangled remains he had inspected that morning with extreme repugnance were those of a youth, nervous, absent-minded, peculiar, and also that the woman who was speaking to him had had the charge of that boy since he was a baby. "Easily excitable," he suggested. "Oh, yes, he is. But how did he come to lose his coat?" Chief Inspector Heat suddenly pulled out a pink newspaper he had bought less than half an hour ago. He was interested in horses. Forced by his calling into an attitude of doubt and suspicion towards his fellow citizens, Chief Inspector Heat relieved the instinct of credulity implanted in the human breast by putting unbounded faith in the sporting profits of that particular evening publication. Dropping the extra special onto the counter, he plunged his hand again into his pocket, and pulling out the piece of cloth fate had presented him with out of a heap of things that seemed to have been collected in shambles and rag shops, he offered it to Mrs. Verloc for inspection. "I suppose you recognize this?" She took it mechanically in both her hands. Her eyes seemed to grow bigger as she looked. "Yes," she whispered, then raised her head and staggered backward a little. "Whatever for is it torn out like this?" The chief inspector snatched across the counter the cloth out of her hands, and she sat heavily on the chair. He thought, identification's perfect. And in that moment he had a glimpse into the whole amazing truth. Verloc was the other man. "Mrs. Verloc," he said, "it strikes me that you know more of this bomb affair than even you yourself are aware of." Mrs. Verloc sat still, amazed, lost in boundless astonishment. What was the connection? And she became so rigid all over that she was not able to turn her head at the clatter of the bell, which caused the private investigator Heat to spin round on his heel. Mr. Verloc had shut the door, and for a moment the two men looked at each other. Mr. Verloc, without looking at his wife, walked up to the chief inspector, who was relieved to see him return alone. "You here?" muttered Mr. Verloc heavily. "Who are you after?" "No one," said Chief Inspector Heat in a low tone. "Look here, I would like a word or two with you." Mr. Verloc, still pale, had brought an air of resolution with him. Still he didn't look at his wife. He said, "Come in here, then," and he led the way into the parlor. The door was hardly shut when Mrs. Verloc, jumping up from the chair, ran to it as if to fling it open, but instead of doing so, fell on her knees with her ear to the keyhole. The two men must have stopped directly they were through, because she heard plainly the chief inspector's voice, though she could not see his finger pressed against her husband's breast emphatically. "You are the other man, Verloc. 2 men were seen entering the park." And the voice of Mr. Verloc said, "Well, take me now. What's to prevent you? You have the right." "Oh, no. I know too well whom you have been giving yourself away to. He'll have to manage this little affair all by himself. But don't you make a mistake. It's I who found you out." Then she heard only muttering. Inspector Heat must have been showing to Mr. Verloc the piece of Stevie's overcoat, because Stevie's sister, guardian, and protector heard her husband a little louder. "I never noticed that she had hit upon that dodge." Again, for a time, Mrs. Verloc heard nothing but murmurs, whose mysteriousness was less nightmarish to her brain than the horrible suggestions of shaped words. Then Chief Inspector Heat, on the other side of the door, raised his voice. "You must have been mad." And Mr. Verloc's voice answered with a sort of gloomy fury, "I have been mad for a month or more, but I am not mad now. It's all over. It shall all come out of my head, and hang the consequences." There was a silence, and then Private Citizen Heat murmured, "What's coming out?" "Everything!" exclaimed the voice of Mr. Verloc, and then sank very low. After a while it rose again. "You have known me for several years now, and you've found me useful too. You know I was a straight man, yes, straight." This appeal to old acquaintance must have been extremely distasteful to the chief inspector. His voice took on a warning note. "Don't you trust so much to what you have been promised. If I were you, I would clear out. I don't think we will run after you." Mr. Verloc was heard to laugh a little. Oh, yes, you hope the others will get rid of me for you, don't you? No, no, you don't shake me off now. I have been a straight man to those people too long, and now everything must come out. Let it come out, then, the indifferent voice of Chief Inspector Heat assented. But tell me now, how did you get away? I was making for Chesterfield Walk, Mrs. Verloc heard her husband's voice, when I heard the bang. I started running then. Fog. I saw no one till I was past the end of George Street. Don't think I met anyone till then. So easy as that, marveled the voice of Chief Inspector Heat. The bang startled you, eh? Yes. It came too soon, confessed the gloomy, husky voice of Mr. Verloc. Mrs. Verloc pressed her ear to the keyhole. Her lips were blue, her hands cold as ice, and her pale face, in which the two eyes seemed like two black holes, felt to her as if it were enveloped in flames. On the other side of the door, the voices sank very low. She caught words now and then, sometimes in her husband's voice, sometimes in the smooth tones of the chief inspector. She heard this last say, "We believe he stumbled against the root of a tree." There was a husky, voluble murmur which lasted for some time, and then the chief inspector, as if answering some inquiry, spoke emphatically. "Of course. Blown to small bits. Limbs, gravel, clothing, bones, splinters, all mixed up together. I tell you, they had to fetch a shovel to gather him up with." Mrs. Verloc sprang up suddenly from her crouching position, and stopping her ears, reeled to and fro between the counter and the shelves on the wall, towards the chair. Her crazed eyes noted the sporting sheet left by the chief inspector, and as she knocked herself against the counter, she snatched it up, fell into the chair, tore the optimistic rosy sheet right across in trying to open it, then flung it on the floor. On the other side of the door, Chief Inspector Heat was saying to Mr. Verloc, the secret agent, "So your defense will be practically a full confession?" "It will. I'm going to tell the whole story. You won't be believed as much as you fancy you will." And the chief inspector remained thoughtful. The turn this affair was taking meant the disclosure of many things, the laying waste of fields of knowledge which, cultivated by a capable man, had a distinct value for the individual and for the society. It was sorry meddling. It would leave Michaelis unscathed. It would drag to light the professor's home industry, disorganize the whole system of supervision, make no end of a row in the papers, which, from that point of view, appeared to him by a sudden illumination as invariably written by fools for the reading of imbeciles. Mentally, he agreed with the words Mr. Verloc let fall at last in answer to his last remark. Perhaps not, but it will upset many things. I have been a straight man, and I shall keep straight in this. If they let you, said the chief inspector cynically, you will be preached to, no doubt, before they put you into the dock. And in the end, you may yet get let in for a sentence that will surprise you. I wouldn't trust too much the gentleman who's been talking to you. Mr. Verloc listened, frowning. My advice to you is to clear out while you may. I have no instructions. There are some of them, continued Chief Inspector Heat, laying a peculiar stress on the word them, who think you are already out of the world. Indeed, Mr. Verloc was moved to say, though since his return from Greenwich he had spent most of his time sitting in the tap room of an obscure little public house, he could hardly have hoped for such favorable news. That's the impression about you. The chief inspector nodded at him. "Vanish! Clear out!" "Where to?" snarled Mr. Verloc. He raised his head and, gazing at the closed door of the parlor, muttered feelingly, "I only wish you would take me away tonight. I would go quietly." "I dare say," assented sardonically the chief inspector, following the direction of his glance. The brow of Mr. Verloc broke into slight moisture. He lowered his husky voice confidentially before the unmoved chief inspector. "The lad was half-witted, irresponsible. Any court would have seen that at once. Only fit for the asylum. And that was the worst that would have happened to him if—" The chief inspector, his hand on the door handle, whispered into Mr. Verloc's face. "He may have been half-witted, but you must have been crazy. What drove you off your head like this?" Mr. Verloc, thinking of Mr. Vladimir, did not hesitate in the choice of words. "A Hyperborean swine," he hissed forcibly. What you might call a gentleman." The chief inspector, steady-eyed, nodded briefly his comprehension and opened the door. Mrs. Verloc, behind the counter, might have heard, but did not see, his departure, pursued by the aggressive clatter of the bell. She sat at her post of duty behind the counter. She sat rigidly erect in the chair, with 2 dirty pink pieces of paper lying spread at her feet. The palms of her hands were pressed convulsively to her face, with the tips of the fingers contracted against the forehead, as though the skin had been a mask which she was ready to tear off violently. The perfect immobility of her pose expressed the agitation of rage and despair, all the potential violence of tragic passions, better than any shallow display of shrieks with the beating of a distracted head against the walls could have done. Chief Inspector Heat, crossing the shop at his busy, swinging pace, gave her only a cursory glance, and when the cracked bell ceased to tremble on its curved ribbon of steel, nothing stirred near Mrs. Verloc, as if her attitude had the locking power of a spell. Even the butterfly-shaped gas flames posed on the ends of the suspended tea-bracket burned without a quiver. In that shop of shady wares, fitted with deal shelves painted a dull brown, which seemed to devour the sheen of the light, the gold circlet of the wedding ring on Mrs. Verloc's left hand glittered exceedingly with the untarnished glory of a piece from some splendid treasure of jewels, dropped in a dustbin. Chapter 10. The assistant commissioner, driven rapidly in a hansom from the neighborhood of Soho in the direction of Westminster, got out at the very center of the empire on which the sun never sets. Some stalwart constables, who did not seem particularly impressed by the duty of watching the august spot, saluted him. Penetrating through a portal by no means lofty into the precincts of the house, which is the house par excellence in the minds of many millions of men, he was met at last by the volatile and revolutionary Toodles. That neat and nice young man concealed his astonishment at the early appearance of the assistant commissioner, whom he had been told to look out for some time about midnight. His turning up so early he concluded to be the sign that things, whatever they were, had gone wrong. With an extremely ready sympathy, which in nice youngsters goes often with a joyous temperament, he felt sorry for the great presence he called the chief, and also for the assistant commissioner, whose face appeared to him more ominously wooden than ever before, and quite wonderfully long. What a queer, foreign-looking chap he is, he thought to himself, smiling from a distance with friendly buoyancy. And directly they came together, he began to talk with the kind intention of burying the awkwardness of failure under a heap of words. It looked as if the great assault threatened for that night were going to fizzle out. An inferior henchman of that brute Cheeseman was up boring mercilessly a very thin house with some shamelessly cooked statistics. He, Toodles, hoped he would bore them into a count-out every minute, but then he might be only marking time to let that guzzling Cheeseman dine at his leisure. Anyway, the chief could not be persuaded to go home. "He will see you at once, I think. He's sitting all alone in his room, thinking of all the fishes of the sea," concluded Toodles airily. "Come along." Notwithstanding the kindness of his disposition, the young private secretary, unpaid, was accessible to the common failings of humanity. He did not wish to harrow the feelings of the assistant commissioner, who looked to him uncommonly like a man who has made a mess of his job. But his curiosity was too strong to be restrained by mere compassion. He could not help, as they went along, throwing over his shoulder lightly, "And your sprat?" "Got him," answered the assistant commissioner with a concision which did not mean to be repellent in the least. "Good. You've no idea how these great men dislike to be disappointed in small things." After this profound observation, the experienced Toodles seemed to reflect. At any rate, he said nothing for quite 2 seconds. Then, "I'm glad. But I say, is it really such a very small thing as you make it out?" "Do you know what may be done with a sprat?" the assistant commissioner asked in his turn. "He's sometimes put into a sardine box," chuckled Toodles, whose erudition on the subject of the fishing industry was fresh, and in comparison with his ignorance of all other industrial matters, immense. "There are sardine canneries on the Spanish coast which—" The assistant commissioner interrupted the apprentice statesman. Yes, but a sprat is also thrown away sometimes in order to catch a whale." "A whale? Whew!" exclaimed Toodles with bated breath. "You're after a whale, then?" "Not exactly. What I am after is more like a dogfish. You don't know, perhaps, what a dogfish is like?" "Yes, I do. We're buried in special books up to our necks, whole shelves full of them with plates. It's a noxious, rascally-looking, altogether detestable beast, with a sort of smooth face and moustaches." "Described to a T," commended the assistant commissioner. "Only mine is clean-shaven altogether. You've seen him. It's a witty fish." "I have seen him?" said Toodles incredulously. "I can't conceive where I could have seen him." "At the Explorers, I should say," dropped the assistant commissioner calmly. At the name of that extremely exclusive club, Toodles looked scared and stopped short. "Nonsense," he protested, but in an awestruck tone. "What do you mean? A member?" "Honorary," muttered the assistant commissioner through his teeth. "Heavens!" Toodles looked so thunderstruck that the assistant commissioner smiled faintly. "That's between ourselves, strictly," he said. "That's the beastliest thing I've ever heard in my life," declared Toodles feebly, as if astonishment had robbed him of all his buoyant strength in a second. The assistant commissioner gave him an unsmiling glance. Till they came to the door of the great man's room, Toodles preserved a scandalized and solemn silence, as though he were offended with the assistant commissioner for exposing such an unsavory and disturbing fact. It revolutionized his idea of the Explorers Club's extreme selectness, of its social purity. Toodles was revolutionary only in politics. His social beliefs and personal feelings he wished to preserve unchanged through all the years allotted to him on this earth. which, upon the whole, he believed to be a nice place to live on. He stood aside.
"Go in without knocking," he said.
Shades of green silk fitted low over all the lights imparted to the room something of a forest's deep gloom. The haughty eyes were physically the great man's weak point. This point was wrapped up in secrecy. When an opportunity offered, he rested them conscientiously. The assistant commissioner, entering, saw at first only a big pale hand supporting a big head and concealing the upper part of a big pale face. An open dispatch box stood on the writing table, near a few oblong sheets of paper and a scattered handful of quill pens. There was absolutely nothing else on the large flat surface except a little bronze statuette draped in a toga, mysteriously watchful in its shadowy immobility. The assistant commissioner, invited to take a chair, sat down. In the dim light, the salient points of his personality, the long face, the black hair, his lankness, made him look more foreign than ever. The great man manifested no surprise, no eagerness, no sentiment whatever. The attitude in which he rested his menaced eyes was profoundly meditative. He did not alter it the least bit, but his tone was not dreamy.
"Well, what is it that you found out already? You came upon something unexpected on the first step."
"Not exactly unexpected, Sir Ethelred. What I mainly came upon was a psychological state." The great presence made a slight movement.
"You must be lucid, please."
"Yes, Sir Ethelred. You know, no doubt, that most criminals at some time or other feel an irresistible need of confessing, of making a clean breast of it to somebody, to anybody. And they do it often to the police. In that Verloc whom Heat wished so much to screen, I've found a man in that particular psychological state. The man, figuratively speaking, flung himself on my breast. It was enough on my part to whisper to him who I was, and to add, 'I know that you are at the bottom of this affair.' It must have seemed miraculous to him that we should know already, but he took it all in the stride. The wonderfulness of it never checked him for a moment. There remained for me only to put to him the two questions: who put you up to it, and who was the man who did it? He answered the first with remarkable emphasis. As to the second question, I gather that the fellow with the bomb was his brother-in-law, quite a lad, a weak-minded creature. It is rather a curious affair, too long, perhaps, to state fully just now."
"What, then, have you learned?"
asked the great man. "First, I've learned that the ex-convict Michaelis had nothing to do with it, though indeed the lad had been living with him temporarily in the country up to 8 o'clock this morning. It is more than likely that Michaelis knows nothing of it to this moment."
"You are positive as to that?"
asked the great man. "Quite certain, Sir Ethelred. This fellow Verloc went there this morning and took away the lad on the pretense of going out for a walk in the lanes. As it was not the first time that he did this, Michaelis could not have the slightest suspicion of anything unusual. For the rest, Sir Ethelred, the indignation of this man Verloc had left nothing in doubt, nothing whatever. He had been driven out of his mind almost by an extraordinary performance, which for you or me it would be difficult to take as seriously meant, but which produced a great impression, obviously, on him." The assistant commissioner then imparted briefly to the great man, who sat still, resting his eyes under the screen of his hand, Mr. Verloc's appreciation of Mr. Vladimir's proceedings and character. The assistant commissioner did not seem to refuse it a certain amount of competency, but the great personage remarked,
"All this seems very fantastic."
"Doesn't it? One would think it a ferocious joke. But our man took it seriously, it appears. He felt himself threatened. Formerly, you know, he was in direct communication with old Stott-Wartenheim himself, and had come to regard his services as indispensable. It was an extremely rude awakening. I imagine that he lost his head. He became angry and frightened. Upon my word, my impression is that he thought these embassy people quite capable not only of throwing him out, but of giving him away, too, in some manner or other. How long were you with him? Interrupted the presence from behind his big hand. Some 40 minutes, Sir Ethelred, in a house of bad repute called the Continental Hotel, closeted in a room which, by the by, I took for the night. I found him under the influence of that reaction which follows the effort of crime. The man cannot be defined as a hardened criminal. It is obvious that he did not plan the death of that wretched lad, his brother-in-law. That was a shock to him. I could see that. Perhaps he is a man of strong sensibilities. Perhaps he was even fond of the lad, who knows? He might have hoped that the fellow would get clear away, in which case it would have been almost impossible to bring this thing home to anyone. At any rate, he risked consciously nothing more than arrest for him. The Assistant Commissioner paused in his speculations to reflect for a moment, though how, in that last case, he could hope to have his own share in the business concealed is more than I can tell, he continued, in his ignorance of poor Stevie's devotion to Mr. Verloc, who was good, and of his truly peculiar dumbness, which in the old affair of fireworks on the stairs had for many years resisted entreaties, coaxing, anger, and other means of investigation used by his beloved sister. For Stevie was loyal. No, I can't imagine. It's possible that he never thought of that at all. It sounds an extravagant way of putting it, Sir Ethelred, but his state of dismay suggested to me an impulsive man who, after committing suicide with the notion that it would end all his troubles, had discovered that it did nothing of the kind. The Assistant Commissioner gave this definition in an apologetic voice, but in truth there is a sort of lucidity proper to extravagant language, and the great man was not offended. A slight jerky movement of the big body, half lost in the gloom of the green silk shades, of the big head leaning on the big hand, accompanied an intermittent, stifled but powerful sound. The great man had laughed. "What have you done with him?" The Assistant Commissioner answered very readily. "As he seemed very anxious to get back to his wife in the shop, I let him go, Sir Ethelred." "You did? But the fellow will disappear." "Pardon me, I don't think so. Where could he go to? Moreover, you must remember that he has got to think of the danger from his comrades, too. He's there at his post. How could he explain leaving it? But even if there were no obstacles to his freedom of action, he would do nothing. At present, he hasn't enough moral energy to take a resolution of any sort. Permit me also to point out that if I had detained him, we would have been committed to a course of action on which I wished to know your precise intentions first." The great personage rose heavily, an imposing, shadowy form in the greenish gloom of the room. "I'll see the Attorney General tonight, and will send for you tomorrow morning. Is there anything more you'd wish to tell me now?" The Assistant Commissioner had stood up also, slender and flexible. "I think not, Sir Ethelred, unless I were to enter into details which—" "No details, please." The great shadowy form seemed to shrink away as if in physical dread of details, then came forward, expanded, enormous and weighty, offering a large hand. "And you say that this man has got a wife?" "Yes, Sir Ethelred," said the Assistant Commissioner, pressing deferentially the extended hand. "A genuine wife and a genuinely respectably marital relation." He told me that after his interview at the embassy, he would have thrown everything up, would have tried to sell his shop and leave the country, only he felt certain that his wife would not even hear of going abroad. Nothing could be more characteristic of the respectable bond than that, went on, with a touch of grimness, the assistant commissioner, whose own wife, too, had refused to hear of going abroad. Yes, a genuine wife, and the victim was a genuine brother-in-law. From a certain point of view, we are here in the presence of a domestic drama. The assistant commissioner laughed a little, but the great man's thoughts seemed to have wandered far away, perhaps to the questions of his country's domestic policy, the battleground of his crusading valor against the Paynim cheesemen. The assistant commissioner withdrew quietly, unnoticed, as if already forgotten. He had his own crusading instincts. This affair, which in one way or another disgusted Chief Inspector Heat, seemed to him a providentially given starting point for a crusade. He had it much at heart to begin. He walked slowly home, meditating that enterprise on the way, and thinking over Mr. Verloc's psychology in a composite mood of repugnance and satisfaction. He walked all the way home. Finding the drawing-room dark, he went upstairs and spent some time between the bedroom and the dressing-room, changing his clothes, going to and fro with the air of a thoughtful somnambulist. But he shook it off before going out again to join his wife at the house of the great lady patroness of Michaelis. He knew he would be welcomed there. On entering the smaller of the two drawing-rooms, he saw his wife in a small group near the piano. A youngish composer in process of becoming famous was discoursing from a music stool to two thick men whose backs looked old, and three slender women whose backs looked young. Behind the screen, the great lady had only two persons with her, a man and a woman, who sat side by side on armchairs at the foot of her couch. She extended her hand to the assistant commissioner. "I never hoped to see you here tonight. Annie told me." "Yes, I had no idea myself that my work would be over so soon." The assistant commissioner added in a low tone, "I am glad to tell you that Michaelis is altogether clear of this." The patroness of the ex-convict received this assurance indignantly. "Why? Were your people stupid enough to connect him with—" "Not stupid," interrupted the assistant commissioner, contradicting deferentially. "Clever enough. Quite clever enough for that." A silence fell. The man at the foot of the couch had stopped speaking to the lady and looked on with a faint smile. "I don't know whether you ever met before," said the great lady. Mr. Vladimir and the assistant commissioner, introduced, acknowledged each other's existence with punctilious and guarded courtesy. "He's been frightening me," declared suddenly the lady who sat by the side of Mr. Vladimir, with an inclination of the head towards that gentleman. The assistant commissioner knew the lady. "You do not look frightened," he pronounced, after surveying her conscientiously with his tired and equable gaze. He was thinking meantime to himself that in this house one met everybody, sooner or later. Mr. Vladimir's rosy countenance was wreathed in smiles because he was witty, but his eyes remained serious, like the eyes of a convinced man. "Well, he tried to, at least," amended the lady. "Force of habit, perhaps," said the assistant commissioner, moved by an irresistible inspiration. "He has been threatening society with all sorts of horrors," continued the lady, whose enunciation was caressing and slow, "apropos of this explosion in Greenwich Park. It appears we all ought to quake in our shoes at what's coming if those people are not suppressed all over the world. I had no idea this was such a grave affair."